Historical records indicate that the position of noblewomen within royal courts was defined less by personal agency and more by proximity to power. Their fortunes were closely tied to the favor of monarchs, a dynamic that could elevate an individual to immense influence or reduce her to isolation with equal speed. Within many pre-modern political systems, especially those structured around hereditary monarchy, favor was not merely social approval. It was a mechanism of governance, shaping alliances, inheritance, and legitimacy. When that favor diminished, the consequences were rarely incidental. They were often deliberate, structured, and deeply embedded in the logic of maintaining authority. Contemporary accounts describe courts as environments governed by surveillance and ritual. Noblewomen queens, consorts, mistresses, and high-ranking ladies-in-waiting operated within tightly controlled hierarchies. Their movements, correspondence, and even expressions of loyalty were subject to scrutiny. Chroniclers noted that influence was frequently exercised informally, through access to the ruler, rather than through official titles. This made such influence inherently unstable. Without institutional protection, a woman's standing could be revoked without formal justification, leaving her vulnerable to accusations, political maneuvering, or simple neglect. Surviving documents suggest that the loss of royal favor was rarely a single event. It often unfolded gradually, marked by subtle exclusions. Invitations to private audiences might cease. Access to the monarch's chambers could be restricted. Gifts and patronage, which had once reinforced status, might be redirected elsewhere. In courts where visibility signaled relevance, such changes were widely observed. Other courtiers adjusted their behavior accordingly, distancing themselves from individuals perceived as declining in influence. This social withdrawal served both as a reflection of shifting power and as a means of reinforcing it. Legal codes of the period reveal that noblewomen were frequently subject to different standards of accountability than their male counterparts. Allegations of moral impropriety, disloyalty, or political intrigue were often sufficient to justify punitive measures, even in the absence of substantial evidence. In many cases, these accusations were less about individual conduct and more about broader concerns of stability. A noblewoman perceived as a threat, whether through her family connections, her influence over succession, or her independent alliances, could be removed under the pretext of moral regulation. Historical records indicate that confinement was one of the most common outcomes for women who fell out of favor. This confinement took multiple forms, depending on the severity of the perceived offense and the political context. Some were placed under house arrest within royal residences, their movements restricted, but their material conditions largely maintained. Others were sent to distant estates, effectively removed from the center of power. In more severe cases, women were confined to convents or religious institutions, a practice that combined social exclusion with a veneer of moral rehabilitation. Contemporary accounts describe convent confinement as both a punitive and pragmatic solution. It allowed monarchs to neutralize potential rivals without resorting to execution, which could provoke public sympathy or political backlash. Within these institutions, noblewomen were expected to adopt religious routines, often relinquishing their previous identities and privileges. While some retained a degree of comfort due to their status, the transition represented a significant loss of autonomy. Chroniclers noted that such confinements could be indefinite, with little possibility of return to court life. Exile represented another common consequence. Surviving documents suggest that exile was often framed as a compromise, avoiding the appearance of cruelty, while effectively severing ties to the political center. Exiled noblewomen might be relocated to foreign courts, allied territories, or remote regions within the kingdom. Their ability to maintain influence depended largely on the networks they could sustain from a distance. In many cases, exile led to gradual obscurity, as the absence from court diminished both visibility and relevance. Financial restriction was also a critical tool of control. Legal codes of the period reveal that access to wealth was frequently contingent on royal approval. When favor was withdrawn, allowances could be reduced or revoked entirely. This had practical implications, limiting a woman's ability to maintain a household, support dependents, or engage in patronage. Economic dependence reinforced social isolation, making it more difficult to rebuild alliances or challenge the circumstances of her removal. Historical records indicate that marriage arrangements could be used strategically in the management of noblewomen who had fallen from favor. In some cases, women were compelled to enter marriages that served political objectives but limited their autonomy. Such unions could remove them from court while binding them to loyal factions. Alternatively, marriages might be annulled or dissolved, particularly if the union itself had become politically inconvenient. These decisions were rarely framed in personal terms. They reflected broader calculations about stability and control. More severe outcomes, including imprisonment and execution, were less common but not absent. Contemporary accounts describe instances where noblewomen were accused of treason, conspiracy, or other crimes deemed threatening to the state. In such cases, legal proceedings were often shaped by political considerations. Evidence could be ambiguous, and verdicts were influenced by the priorities of the ruling authority. Chroniclers noted that executions, when they occurred, were often highly controlled events, intended to reinforce the consequences of disloyalty while minimizing potential unrest. Surviving documents suggest that public perception played a significant role in determining how these situations were handled. Monarchs were often aware of the need to maintain legitimacy, which required careful management of appearances. Punishments that appeared excessive or unjust could undermine authority, particularly if the individual in question had previously been widely respected. As a result, measures such as confinement or exile were often preferred, as they allowed for the removal of a potential threat without provoking widespread sympathy. The lived realities of these women were shaped by a combination of structural constraints and individual circumstances. While some were able to adapt to their new conditions, maintaining limited networks of support, others experienced profound isolation. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological impact of sudden displacement from positions of influence, noting the loss of purpose and identity that often accompanied such transitions. These experiences were rarely documented in personal terms, but indirect evidence, such as correspondence and administrative records, suggests that the consequences extended beyond the political sphere. Historical records indicate that the mechanisms used to manage noblewomen who fell out of favor were not arbitrary. They were part of broader systems of governance that prioritized stability, control, and the preservation of authority. These systems relied on a combination of formal regulations and informal practices, allowing rulers to respond flexibly to perceived threats. The treatment of noblewomen must therefore be understood within this context, as an extension of the same principles that governed other aspects of court life. Chroniclers noted that the outcomes for these women were often determined by factors beyond their control, including shifts in political alliances, changes in succession, and the influence of rival factions. In some cases, a change in leadership could lead to rehabilitation, with previously disgraced individuals restored to favor. In others, the consequences were permanent, with little opportunity for reversal. These variations reflect the inherently unstable nature of court politics, where fortunes could change rapidly and unpredictably. Surviving documents suggest that the experiences of these women also had broader implications for the structure of power. Their removal could alter the balance of influence within the court, creating opportunities for others to rise. At the same time, the visible consequences of falling out of favor served as a deterrent, reinforcing norms of loyalty and obedience. In this sense, the treatment of noblewomen functioned not only as a response to individual circumstances, but also as a means of maintaining the overall stability of the political system. Patterns observed across different courts and periods reveal a consistent reliance on controlled removal rather than overt violence. While the specific methods varied, the underlying logic remained similar. Noblewomen who lost favor were not simply dismissed. They were managed in ways that minimized disruption while reinforcing the authority of the ruler. This approach reflects a broader understanding of power as something that must be continuously negotiated and defended, often through subtle and indirect means. Surviving correspondence and administrative records indicate that the removal of noblewomen from court life did not necessarily conclude their political relevance. In many cases, displacement initiated a different form of negotiation, conducted through intermediaries, family networks, and written appeals. Letters preserved in state archives suggest that women who had fallen from favor often attempted to re-establish their position by appealing to influential figures, including senior nobles, clerical authorities, or members of the monarch's inner circle. These efforts rarely relied on direct confrontation. Instead, they emphasized loyalty, repentance, or the strategic invocation of kinship ties. Historical records indicate that family connections played a decisive role in determining outcomes. Noblewomen were seldom isolated individuals. They were representatives of broader dynastic interests. Their treatment, therefore, had implications beyond their personal circumstances. Contemporary accounts describe instances in which powerful families intervened on behalf of disgraced relatives, negotiating reduced penalties or improved conditions of confinement. Such interventions were not always successful, particularly when the monarch perceived the family itself as a potential threat. However, the existence of these negotiations demonstrates that the process was not entirely unilateral. It involved a degree of bargaining shaped by the relative strength of competing factions. Legal petitions from the period reveal that accusations against noblewomen were often framed in terms that allowed for ambiguity. Charges such as improper influence or conduct unbecoming lacked precise definitions, enabling authorities to apply them flexibly. This ambiguity served a practical function. It allowed for the adjustment of penalties without requiring formal reversal of earlier judgments. A woman initially confined under suspicion of misconduct might later be granted limited freedoms, not through exoneration, but through a reinterpretation of her situation. Chroniclers noted that such adjustments were frequently presented as acts of royal mercy, reinforcing the ruler's image as both authoritative and benevolent. Examination of court records suggests that time itself was an important factor in these processes. The immediate aftermath of a fall from favor was often the most severe, marked by strict isolation and limited communication. Over time, however, conditions could evolve. Restrictions might be eased, financial allowances partially restored, or supervised correspondence permitted. These changes were rarely announced publicly. They occurred within administrative frameworks, reflecting shifts in political priorities rather than formal policy decisions. For the individuals involved, such gradual improvements could represent the only viable path toward a more stable existence. Contemporary accounts describe the role of religious institutions not only as places of confinement, but also as centers of mediation. Clergy members occasionally acted as intermediaries, conveying petitions or advocating for more lenient treatment. This involvement was consistent with the broader function of the church as both a moral authority and a political actor. In some cases, appeals framed in religious terms emphasizing repentance, humility, or spiritual transformation proved more effective than overtly political arguments. Surviving documents suggest that this strategy allowed petitioners to align their requests with prevailing moral frameworks, making them more acceptable to ruling authorities. Historical records indicate that not all outcomes were defined by permanent exclusion. There are documented cases in which noblewomen regained a degree of favor, particularly following significant changes within the court. The death of a monarch, the accession of a new ruler, or the reconfiguration of alliances could create opportunities for rehabilitation. Contemporary accounts describe how individuals previously marginalized were sometimes recalled to court, their return framed as a restoration of balance or justice. These reversals, however, were contingent on shifting political conditions rather than on any consistent principle of fairness. The management of reputation played a central role throughout these processes. Chroniclers noted that narratives surrounding a noblewoman's fall were carefully shaped to serve broader objectives. Official records might emphasize moral failings or breaches of loyalty, while minimizing the political context. Conversely, efforts to rehabilitate an individual often involved the gradual reconfiguration of these narratives, highlighting virtues such as piety or endurance. This manipulation of reputation extended beyond formal documentation. It influenced how contemporaries understood and responded to these events, shaping the social environment in which reintegration might occur. Surviving letters and memoirs suggest that the experience of displacement often led to the development of alternative forms of influence. Noblewomen in exile or confinement sometimes maintained correspondence networks that allowed them to remain informed about court developments. Through these networks, they could offer advice, coordinate with allies, or support the interests of their families. While such influence was limited compared to direct access to the monarch, it demonstrates that removal from court did not necessarily equate to complete political inactivity. Economic considerations continued to shape these dynamics. Records of estate management reveal that some women retained control over certain properties or revenues, even after losing favor. This financial base provided a degree of independence, enabling them to sustain households and maintain social connections. In other cases, economic restrictions were enforced more rigorously, leaving individuals dependent on the goodwill of relatives or patrons. The variation in these outcomes reflects the absence of a single standardized approach, with decisions tailored to specific circumstances and perceived risks. Legal codes of the period also reveal the importance of precedent, though not in a strictly formalized sense. Rulers and their advisors were often aware of how similar situations had been handled in the past. This awareness influenced decision-making, particularly in high-profile cases where public perception was a concern. Punishments that aligned with established patterns were less likely to provoke controversy, while deviations required careful justification. As a result, the treatment of noblewomen who fell out of favor tended to follow recognizable trajectories, even as individual details varied. Contemporary observers frequently interpreted these events through the lens of morality, attributing outcomes to personal virtue or failing. However, surviving documents suggest that such interpretations often obscured the underlying political calculations. Decisions were shaped by considerations of stability, alliance management, and the preservation of authority. Moral language provided a framework for public communication, but it did not fully account for the complexity of the processes involved. Recognizing this distinction is essential for understanding how these systems operated in practice. The long-term consequences of falling out of favor extended beyond the immediate individuals. Family networks could be weakened, alliances disrupted, and lines of succession altered. In some cases, the removal of a prominent woman created opportunities for rival factions to consolidate power. In others, it destabilized existing arrangements, leading to further conflict. Historical records indicate that these ripple effects were often anticipated by those in authority, influencing both the timing and manner of intervention. Chroniclers noted that the visibility of these consequences served an instructive function within the court. Controlled decline of a once influential figure provided a tangible demonstration of the limits of favor. It reinforced the understanding that proximity to power was conditional and could be withdrawn. This awareness shaped behavior, encouraging caution and conformity among those who remained within the court's inner circles. At the same time, it contributed to an environment of uncertainty, where alliances were continually reassessed in response to shifting dynamics. Surviving administrative records also highlight the role of gender in shaping these experiences. While both men and women could fall out of favor, the mechanisms applied to noblewomen often emphasize containment and moral regulation. This distinction reflects broader societal expectations regarding female behavior and authority. Women who exercised influence beyond accepted boundaries were more likely to be framed as disruptive, justifying measures aimed at limiting their agency. These patterns were not uniform across all contexts, but they appear consistently enough to suggest an underlying structural bias. Historical records indicate that the systems governing these outcomes were adaptive rather than rigid. They allowed for a range of responses, from mild restriction to severe punishment, depending on the perceived threat and the available options. This flexibility was a key feature of monarchical governance, enabling rulers to address challenges without undermining their own legitimacy. The treatment of noblewomen who fell out of favor illustrates how these systems functioned in practice, balancing the need for control with the constraints imposed by political and social realities. As time progressed, the cumulative effect of these practices contributed to a broader understanding of court life as inherently precarious. Contemporary accounts describe an environment in which status was continually negotiated, and where even established figures remained vulnerable to sudden change. Within this context, the experiences of noblewomen who lost favor were not isolated incidents, but integral components of a larger system, reflecting the complexities and contradictions of power in hierarchical societies. Historical records indicate that in the final stages of a noblewoman's separation from court life, the distinction between punishment and administrative management often became increasingly blurred. What began as political exclusion could gradually solidify into a permanent condition, shaped less by explicit decree and more by the accumulation of restrictions over time. Surviving documents suggest that this process was frequently characterized by procedural normalcy. Orders regarding residence, correspondence, and financial support were recorded in the same formal language used for routine governance, masking the profound personal consequences embedded within them. Contemporary accounts describe how institutional inertia contributed to the permanence of such outcomes. Once a noblewoman was removed from the center of power, reintegration required sustained effort from multiple actors, including courtiers, family members, and occasionally the monarch themselves. In practice, however, Attention within the court shifted rapidly toward emerging priorities. New alliances formed, new figures gained prominence, and administrative focus moved accordingly. Without continuous advocacy, the possibility of restoration diminished, not through formal prohibition, but through gradual neglect. Legal codes of the period reveal that even when full rehabilitation occurred, it rarely implied a return to previous status. Instead, reinstated individuals were often assigned carefully defined roles that limited their access to sensitive political spaces. This recalibration of position allowed rulers to demonstrate clemency while maintaining control over potential risks. Chroniclers noted that such arrangements reflected a broader principle of governance. Favor could be restored, but trust, once disrupted, was rarely fully re-established. Historical records indicate that the final outcomes for noblewomen who had fallen out of favor varied widely, yet they consistently reflected the priorities of stability and continuity within the ruling system. Some individuals remained in long-term confinement within religious institutions, their presence gradually absorbed into the daily functioning of those communities. Others lived out their lives in relative isolation on estates, maintaining only limited correspondence with former networks. In rare instances, former courtiers were permitted to return to ceremonial roles, though these positions carried symbolic rather than substantive influence. Surviving correspondence from exiled or secluded noblewomen provides insight into the enduring psychological and social dimensions of their displacement. These letters, often addressed to relatives or intermediaries, emphasize themes of loyalty, endurance, and petition for reconsideration. The language used tends to be restrained, shaped by both convention and caution. Direct criticism of the court or monarch is largely absent, reflecting an awareness of the continued sensitivity of their position. Instead, appeals are framed in terms of duty, lineage, and the hope of eventual reconciliation. Contemporary accounts suggest that memory and reputation remained active forces even after formal exclusion. Within court society, the past status of a noblewoman could continue to influence how she was perceived and discussed. This lingering recognition could function in contradictory ways. In some cases, it preserved the possibility of future rehabilitation. In others, it reinforced the justification for continued exclusion, particularly if her earlier influence had been associated with factional conflict or political instability.